The oil giant Shell has won a landmark case in a Dutch court today, overturning an earlier ruling that required that it cut its carbon emissions by 45%. The Hague Court of Appeal said it could not establish that Shell had a social standard of care to reduce its emissions by 45% or any other amount, even though the court agreed that the company had an obligation to citizens to limit emissions. Well, 3 years ago, the court in The Hague had backed a case by Friends of the Earth and 17,000 Dutch citizens requiring Shell to reduce its CO2 emissions in line with the Paris Climate Accords. More on that story from Emerald Maxwell.
It came as a major disappointment. The climate activists gathered outside the courthouse in The Hague. As inside, the Dutch appeals court reversed a landmark ruling that imposed steep carbon emissions reductions on energy company Shell.
This should have been the moment of a real breakthrough in the fight against dangerous climate change. That didn't happen today, but the fight against dangerous climate change is a marathon, not a sprint, and the race has only just begun.
Hailed as historic, the original 2021 ruling said Shell must reduce its carbon emissions by 45% by 2030 compared to 2019. But on Tuesday, the appeals court dismissed that ruling, saying that although the multinational had a duty of care to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, there was currently insufficient consensus in climate science on a specific reduction percentage to which an individual company like Shell should adhere. After a string of courtroom victories, it's a defeat for climate activists, leaving a question mark over whether climate litigation is the right approach.
Well, there are some points of light, I guess, that the court, they acknowledge that Shell actually has to reduce their emissions. However, we cannot go further with this court case like this.
It's very disappointing, obviously, and it also kind of shows that maybe this isn't the right way to force Shell's hand in this matter.
Dutch environmentalists have not said whether they would launch a further appeal at the Netherlands Supreme Court. But Tuesday's decision was welcomed by Shell's CEO, who said the company believed it was the right one for the global energy transition, the Netherlands and our company. In March, Shell weakened its carbon emissions reduction targets, citing sustained demand for fossil fuels.
Well, for a little more on this story now, we're joined from Amsterdam by Nina de Pater, who is the lead campaigner in this case against Shell at Friends of the Earth, the Netherlands, or there is a Dutch word for it. You've been behind this lawsuit since 2018. Nina de Pater, welcome to the programme. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us here on France 24. I want to ask you first, just what is your reaction to this ruling today?
Yeah, obviously, when we first heard the ruling, it was kind of a shock. We did, of course, hope for more because there's more. We need more for the climate. We already see the results of the impact of the climate crisis. Last week in Spain, the immense floodings. So, of course, we need more action. We need climate action right now. So that was, I think, the first reaction. But then when we looked at the ruling a bit better, we can conclude there's a lot of positive things in there that we can really build on. And to give you an example, the judge clearly said that protection against climate change is a basic human right. And that's a vital thing for a court to say. And that's also something very important for other court cases around the world, because this is what we can build on. And she didn't only say that the climate crisis is a threat to human rights. It is also a responsibility of companies to respect human rights. So it's not just states, but also companies that have to act and have to reduce their emissions in order to protect human rights.
She did, as you say, that human right. She did appear to rule that it is a human right to be protected from climate change. And that, from your point of view, is definitely a positive. Nevertheless, Shell argued that they weren't responsible for climate policy, that if activists wanted changes or improvements in climate policy, they should lobby governments, and that it wasn't fair to target Shell, so long as they were acting within the law. They had no obligation to go further. Does that have big implications for other corporate climate responsibility cases?
I think at this point it is difficult to say what the implications will be exactly, but all the jurisdictions are different and all of these cases are different. This court case was especially about Shell. The judge did give some points that we can build on other cases. For example, the one about the human rights, but also the fact that she stated that companies such as Shell have the obligation to reduce their CO2 emissions. That in itself is already a very strong point. And then I think the next step that we need to take is having this discussion about what percentage is necessary. And that's the next step. But for now, we can definitely use, and everyone that is involved with climate litigation can use this argument that the judge did agree that companies have their own responsibility.
While we have you here, Nina de Pater, I wonder if I could ask you about the US elections and, of course, the re-election of Donald Trump, who has in the past called climate change a hoax. He's a big fan of fossil fuels. How do organisations like yours plan to deal with his return and its impact on climate change issues?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. It is still early. The climate science is very clear, and we've made a lot of progression since the first time that Trump was in position as a president. For example, in the European Union, we have the Green Deal. We have a lot of laws that also protect us against human rights violations. For example, the Corporate Sustainability Responsibility Directive. I don't think I said it right, but the CSDDD. That's a law that gives companies the obligation to come up with a climate plan to reduce their emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. So I think that, of course, it is a setback for many climate activists that Trump was re-elected, but at the same time, we are living now in a reality with a lot more than we had last time, and I think that we can still continue our fight against climate change.
And, you know, he was elected comfortably. It seems the American voters were quite unbothered by his stance on environmental issues. Are you worried that the tide is turning around the world somewhat against climate change activists, that they're overreaching sometimes and that they're not really anymore in step with public opinion? Is that something you worry about?
I think it is more a question of what do people prioritize. So when you look at some research in the Netherlands, you see that people do worry about climate change, but at the moment they prioritize other problems. So it is not that they are against climate policies or the opinions of climate activists. It is that they choose their leaders based on different opinions and different issues. So of course, I'm not from the USA, so I'm not sure how people feel about climate change there. But in Europe, you can definitely see that that during elections, at the moment, climate change is not the priority, but it doesn't mean that people don't worry about it.
OK, well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us, Nina de Pater. We do appreciate very much your time here on France 24. And we're moving on to London.